that when we begin to wrestle with God, God has to strike us sometimes with what Ellen White calls with a wound that heals. God reached down and he touched the hip of Jacob. And as he displaced it, the message was to Jacob, no more running. You think you're so fast. You think you're so smart. You think you got what it takes and you've been running from your problem, but it's right behind you now. Let me give you a message, Jacob, this morning. I'm talking to myself. He says, no more running. No more running. You've run far enough. You haven't given me a chance to show you how big I am. You haven't given me the opportunity to show you that I know the solution. You keep trying to solve your own problems. But Jacob, no more running. Jacob kept wrestling with him, held on to him. And he said, let me go because the day is going to break. And what was Jacob's famous answer? I will not let you go unless you bless me. You know, God wants to give us a blessing. Sometimes our greatest curse, like a fractured hip, will end up being your greatest blessing. Sometimes your greatest curse becomes your greatest blessing. But God wants to bless us, and sometimes he has to strike us with the wound that heals. It's not always pretty. God's blessings don't always feel good, but they're good for us. These are things that I think we're all learning. I'm only 30 years old, and I'm learning these things. God has struck me. I'm probably like a daredevil. I've got pins in both hips. I broke a toe, broke my hand twice, broke both arms. Like I've got a number of broken bones, and I don't know if it's God striking me with the wound that heals, but I got a lot to learn. So God has a lot to teach me, and I got a lot of bones. So, you know, when I learn these lessons that God is teaching, we just have to remember it's good for us. Jacob here is asked the question, what is your name? God is asking him to reflect. If God were to ask you this morning, what is your name? And you had to relate your name with the way people react when they hear your name. How do people respond when they hear your name? How do they remember you when they see you driving the way you drive here in Texas? I know sometimes in Dallas, you know, right on that 35, some of us almost lose our Christianity sometimes, right? And imagine if your name was on the back of your car as you were driving up the 35. Would you act a little different? Right? Jacob, you cut me off. Jacob, you know sign language. But imagine if your name was on the back of the vehicle. If God came and asked you today, what is your name? Jacob had to go back to chapter 27. And Jacob had to begin to unveil the different chapters of his life. God, my name is Jacob the thief, Jacob the deceiver. And all these attachments to Jacob's name, because Jacob was wrestling with God, because Jacob came and sought the blessing, because Jacob recognized that he is God, God decided to bless him. God said, your name is no longer Jacob, but your name is Israel. The origin of this name, right here in chapter 32, Israel. But you know, just because God gives us a new name doesn't mean that Jacob is erased completely. Our past is always with us. It's connected to us. It's a part of us. But God is offering us something a little better. God is offering us an alternative. God is saying, you don't have to be Jacob forever. You don't have to be this deceiver, this thief forever. I want to offer you something better. I want to give you my name. I want to call you Israel, and I want to be your God. Do you want victory? Do you want to overcome? Do you want to let your problems know that you have the solution? Let me be your God, Jacob. Jacob stood up after that wrestling match. He was probably tired, but he could see the sun coming up in the distance, and Jacob probably grabbed his hip as he tried to move forward. But when we open up to chapter 33, we read that when Jacob raised his eyes, when he looked up that next morning, his problem was in front of him. Esau with 400 mighty men, they had been moving fast. They'd been coming at Jacob, and they've got bad intentions for Jacob. And when Jacob raises his head and he sees them, he begins to get things in order again, and he lines up his servants and lines up his wives and the kids with their mothers, and then Jacob does something. He bows down all the way to the ground 7 times. 7 times to the ground. And as he raises up the 7th time, Esau is already running at him. We don't know what Esau is running for until suddenly he wraps his arms around his neck and he embraces him. Esau embraces the brother, the deceiver, the thief. Maybe there's something different about Jacob now. Maybe there's something that God has done and people see a difference in Jacob now. But how about us, church family? When we wrestle with God all night with the problems that we have, do people see the difference in us? 7 times down to the floor, bowing 7 times. This is the ultimate view of humility. And church family, if we want to know how to win the world, if we want to know how to take the gospel to the world, if we want to know how to share God with a world that doesn't love him, we need to wrestle with God. We need to humble ourselves before God. We have to stand in the light of Christ and recognize who we are in his presence. And when we humble ourselves before God and we come in contact with our co-workers, with our fellow students, with our family members, before our spouses, before our children, if you've humbled yourself before God, Ellen White says in Ministry of Healing, everyone who came in touch with Jesus left changed. Not one who came in contact with him left the same. They all left different. But she says they were attracted to his humility. They were attracted to his humility. She also writes in Mount of Blessings that this is the greatest characteristic of God. Equivalent to love is humility. And if we want to vindicate God's character, we need to learn humility. If we want to win the world, Jacob won the heart of his brother with humility. And here Esau is excited. Who is this, Jacob? Who are these women and who are these children? And Jacob said, this is my family. These are your nephews. You've got a lot of nephews. And Esau he's ready to take his place. Esau takes a step back and he says, all right, Jacob, you've given me all these gifts. And Jacob says, here's a few more. And Esau says, no, it's too much. But look, Jacob, listen, I think I'm ready to take my place as the older brother again. Jacob, I want you to follow me back to Sire. Jacob, I'm ready for you to come and take your place as the younger brother. Follow me, and I'm going to take our family over to Sire. Esau never wrestled with God. I think Jacob knew this. Jacob turned to Esau. He said, Esau, you've got 400 warriors. You guys been traveling probably more than 2 times faster than my family and I have, and you were on my tail these last few years. You've been moving fast. Esau, if I move at your pace, my children won't last. Esau, if I move at your pace, the cattle that are feeding, that are nursing, they can't move at your pace. They'll all die. Look, Esau, why don't you and your 400 men move at your pace? I'm going to take my family and move at my pace, and we'll meet you in Sire. This sounds like wisdom. Esau had not humbled himself before God. He's not safe to follow. If we are going to pray for leadership in our church, if we are going to pray for leadership in our world, we need humble leaders. We need leaders who have humbled themselves before God. Because if you haven't humbled yourself before God, you may not be safe to follow, and you're going to lose a lot of people on the way. Jacob says to Esau, just go ahead and I'll meet you there. Here we find Jacob, still Jacob, not Israel. Jacob never made it to Sire. Some of us are still got the Jacob in us, but God has still given us the name Israel. Jacob has come to this place called Shechem, and he does something very special in this place. Jacob does 2 things, and I need you to pay attention to these 2 things, because if you go home with it, he pitches his tent in Shechem. The second thing he does is he raises an altar. This is Jacob's first altar. And as Jacob resurrects this altar, altars in the Bible are not just random places. Prophets didn't just resurrect an altar wherever they want in front of HEB. There are designated places that God creates for altars to be raised. And it's whenever God decides to move, whenever God steps in and decides to reveal himself, whenever God steps in and he says, when I move left, you move left. If not, I may have to strike you with the wound that heals. When God moves in a mighty way, it's time to raise an altar. God had delivered Jacob, and Jacob knew this. And here in Shechem, Jacob decides to raise an altar, and he names the altar. The altar is called God, the God of Israel. But how about us this morning, church? In the places that God has moved mighty in our lives, have we raised the altars? A famous place that altars are raised is right here at the pulpit. Preachers often make altar calls here at the pulpit because God often decides to move mightily from this space. It's not the only place, but often God uses the pulpit to raise his altars. And when people would come by in these locations and they'd see these altars, they knew that it was God's altar because it had no image. It had no form. These altars were made of rock and wood, and they were just structured upward. And when people saw them, they knew that God had moved. A pastor by the name of Don McIntosh went to Honduras for a mission trip. And in Honduras, there are these mountains. And up the mountains, there are these villages that have never heard the gospel. And Don decided, I need to go up this mountain with a mission team, and we need to take the gospel to these people. So they looked for a bus driver when they arrived, and as they made their way up the mountain, Don noticed that there were no guardrails. And as the pastor sat behind the bus driver, he looks out the window, and it looks like they're about to go over the cliff. And Don thinks it's the end of his life, but the bus driver begins to turn the wheel. His heart is racing. At the next corner, Don's looking out the window. It looks like he's going to lose his life. And then the bus driver turns the wheel. Corner after corner. As the bus driver began to turn, Don thinks it might be the last corner. When they arrived safely, Don just had to ask. And he came to the bus driver and he says to him, "How did you know? Every corner it looked like we should have gone over, but how did you know?" The bus driver said, "Many people have gone over the corners. Many buses and many lives have been lost. But every time families would lose family members over these corners, they'd come up and they create these white wooden crosses and they nail them into the corners. And Pastor, every time I would see a cross, I knew that it was time to turn. Every time I would see a cross at this corner, Pastor, I knew it was time to turn." And the altar being raised this morning is just one of those crosses. That maybe there are some of us in here this morning that need to see an altar. Maybe there are some of us here this morning that are looking for the cross. Jesus had said that if I be lifted up, I would draw all men unto me. Some of us are looking for Jesus this morning. Some of us are looking for God this morning. Some of us have problems. It might be physical. It might be spiritual. It might be financial. But we are looking for God this morning. And here at the pulpit, we're going to raise the altar. And we're going to resurrect the cross. And we're going to lift up Jesus. I'm going to invite our music team up here to prepare to do our last hymn, is Near the Cross. But as we sing this song, church, I want to urge you to contemplate that God is bigger than your problem. That God is mightier than your situation. Whatever your circumstance might be, it might be a relationship, maybe with siblings, maybe with children, maybe with grandchildren, maybe whatever your situation is, I want to let you know this morning that God is mighty. He's mighty to deliver you. God wants to. It might not feel good at first, but God wants to walk with you through it. And God wants to move in a mighty way. And as we sing this song, I don't want to invite you to stand because I want to leave that for maybe someone here this morning that wants to make that stand. And you want to say to God, "God, I am Jacob. My name is Joe Tonga. God, this is who I am." And you watch God move in your life. I want to invite our music team up here as we sing this song. I'll sing with you. Near the Cross. As we sing this song, you're free to stand with us if you want to stand for that appeal.